You can ask me anything you want. I'll reserve the right to say no comment, but you can ask.
This
You
could
can
be the
ask
first
anything.
time. This could be the first time someone's pleaded the fifth on on this
That's
podcast.
funny.
Hi and welcome. You are listening to the Philosophists, a pair of software guys, but we won't be doing that all our lives. No. Instead of cutting code at full throttle, we'll be trying to channel our inner Aristotle and inject a little philosophy into your day. And what would the great Greek like more than today's topic? Well, almost nothing, as we'll be discussing wisdom itself. To help us, we'll be talking to Jason Murchie, a 4-book author on the topic of wisdom, including his latest work, Wisdom, a very valuable virtue that cannot be bought. As you'll hear, Jason is a deep philosophical thinker. We thought he'd be a great fit for the show, as he too wants to bring philosophical thinking to everyone, not just an academic audience. And as a master's level psychologist, he brings a rich understanding of what makes a person tick. Everyone loves a good old meme, and one thing you'll hear Jason talk about is his wisdom search engine, which you can try out for yourself, along with lots of other resources on his website, valuesofthewise.com. In addition to the question of wisdom, you'll hear us talking about the following: capitalism, Sisyphus and higher values, the wisdom and anti-wisdom of intuition, common sense and its relationship to wisdom, the knowing nod of older Ireland, conflating status with wisdom, if America is wise or unwise, respecting elders but perhaps not their ideas, and what can Foucault, Trump and Mussolini teach us about Irish house prices. Finally, we also ask how to stay sane in an insane world. This is a long play episode, and like an epic soccer match, tips over the 90-minute mark, but we're sure there's plenty of action to make the time fly by. We have included chapter markers for the more edgy of you who will want to jump around a bit in a frenzied manner. Anyway, my name is Declan McGrath, hoping you value this episode as much as you value wisdom. Though one thing you won't value is the absence of Simon again. Bizarrely, for a pair of sedate old philosophers, we've both fallen into the world of sports team coaching for different teams and different sports. So our schedules are stubbornly refusing to align at the moment, and you may need to brace yourself for this for another episode or two, or until one of us loses the backing of the board and ends up on the managerial scrap heap. One more thing, in this episode there was a lot of ground covered, as the breadth of Jason's book is quite wide, and I felt it would give a better flavour of the book to take that approach. As a result, I didn't drill into certain topics, including very specific areas of philosophy, deep into the weeds of various politics, the topic of gender and preferred pronoun usage of individuals. So, if there are any topics in there that you would like to discuss more deeply with Jason, do get in touch with the show and we might be able to schedule a follow-up conversation. Okay, let's get philosophistical. I'm here today with Jason Murchie, author of the book Wisdom, a very valuable virtue that cannot be bought. So welcome today, Jason. It's great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
It's a very valuable virtue that cannot be bought. Maybe first we'll start with you rather than the book and how you came to write this book and a little bit on your background.
Okay. Values, virtues, wisdom, ethics, personal growth, these types of things have interested me for quite some time. Came from a broken home and I wasn't raised Christian. So there were just a lot of challenges in regard to, developing into adolescence and getting through adolescence. I was not terribly secure either, in that emotional, psychological sense. So, my childhood was harder than it probably should have been or could be. And I just kind of became very attracted to psychology, the applied side of it, the M. Scott Peck type of approach to psychology. I don't know if you know the book, The Road Less Traveled, but it was written in the 70s and it's a popular way of looking at some of these hallmark concepts in the field of psychology. He'll quote somebody like Erich Fromm or Rollo May or Reinhold Niebuhr, some of these humanistic psychologists or philosophers or theologians. So I was interested in things like that. Philosophy to me just kind of came out of the blue when I took a class when I was about 18. I thought it was fantastic, not just because it was interesting. Obviously philosophy is something you have to really kind of try hard to understand. So it provided a challenge, but more so it was a way for me to try to understand the complexity that I was experiencing at that time in my life. Philosophy gets into the big questions. And so teenagers, especially those who have certain amounts of trouble and psychological symptoms, angst, whatever, philosophy can be very useful because it helps you to ask important questions and arrive at some sort of, maybe tentative, but some sort of answers. And it's helpful to know that you have some understanding of what is true. Truth is a very important concept, and that's what philosophy aims to do, to get into how do we know such and such, and what is true, and what is the good, and what are proper values to have, and what's ethics, and what is the end of all of this, meaning the thing to which we all should be striving. And those were super interesting things. So fast forwarding into the 21st century, I studied psychology in college, did some counseling on both sides of the couch, I guess you could say. And one day it just kind of struck me that I should write my fourth book, just get it done. And the subject of wisdom was the winner. I decided to write a book on that. Now, there were many reasons why I wanted to write a book about wisdom when there would be other things that I could have chosen, or heck, I could have chosen not to write a book. One important factor was having been influenced by Stephen S. Hall, the author of a book called Wisdom: From Philosophy to Neuroscience. That's a 2010 book that I found to be fantastic. He got in touch with many luminaries in the fields of philosophy, psychology, behavioral economics, things like this, psychiatry. And he met with all of them and got fresh perspectives and quotes and put together a wonderful book. He goes as far back as Confucius, Socrates, and so on, but also gets into brain imaging aspects of really modern neurological research, just to try to understand what wisdom is from many, many different angles. So, I gotta admit, I kind of use that as a springboard, meaning I studied the heck out of that book, took notes, made outlines, took some quotes out of it, both from him and from people he was quoting. And then I began to sit down and say, what book about wisdom do I want to write?
And you also have a bank, just to bring in everything into play, maybe you have a background in real estate as well.
Yes, I'd say the investing side of real estate. I did try to be a real estate agent, buying and selling, representing buyers and sellers, and I failed at that. But I find investing to be a little easier, especially if you're a little introverted like I am. So yeah, there is a little bit of overlap. If you were to think of a Venn diagram between wisdom and this book and real estate investing, you obviously want to utilize wisdom in your real estate investing. Most people don't think of it like that, but I believe that's true. And then I think, to be an investor informs certain aspects of myself. And I guess I'm trying to say one can study philosophy, psychology, and personal growth and humanism and theology and so on. But if you're sitting at your desk without ever leaving your office, your understanding of things are going to be, truncated. So if you're a real estate investor, what you're doing is you're putting your money and to some degree your ass on the line, and you're saying, I know this, so I'm so confident about this that I'm going to put my money at risk and just roll the dice and see how it goes. And by doing that and having all those experiences, flipping a house or being a landlord or investing with 25 partners, things like this. It just kind of matures you a bit and makes you realize that, it's real deal stuff. And it makes wisdom come alive a little bit more. There's a little bit of a conjoined nature between those two subjects. But for the most part, I tend to think of real estate investing as what I do. I'm sort of a capitalist. That's kind of a vacuous thing to do for a living to some degree, at least for me, at least with my level of success. Maybe if I were, extremely successful, it would constantly challenge and intrigue me and whatever. But because of where I am in my investing capacity, I find that reading things that are deeper, more interesting, more subjective than capitalism is a way to try to access my aspirations and to grow in my psychological development and things like this.
Yeah, so it balances you out with the yin and the yang a little bit, maybe.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't be a very successful husband and person, consumer or whatever, if I had to rely on my book royalties. I can tell you that for sure. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, if I only could do capitalistic endeavors, it would be kind of like, I don't know, there's a little bit of Sisyphean absurdity to investing. So to clarify, I'm referring to a Greek myth called the myth of Sisyphus. And it was popularized in the 20th century by Albert Camus. But, basically the story is that Sisyphus has done something that made the Greek gods angry with him. He was cursed to have to go through the same thing over and over and over again for eternity. And it's extremely boring and banal, and yet he must do it. So he has to push a boulder to the top of a hill, which is obviously extremely difficult. He has to work through all of that, physicality. And once he gets the boulder up to the top of the mountain, but the point being, the gods have cursed him by making each day repetitive ad absurdum. So he must do that again the next day. And then the day after that, he does it again. And the day after that, he does it again. The day after that, he does it again. And so I think maybe in some minor way, being a capitalist can be kind of, a little soul stealing, right? You have to try to outdo other people and profit at their expense. And you're always trying to do the thing that's marketable, not necessarily right. Human beings, they have an economic system in capitalism that works more or less well, maybe a little less well than well, but no one would probably be able to say that it is the highest that humanity can aspire to or achieve. I don't think that when Michelangelo crafted David over that many year period, it took him years to find the piece of marble, and then he had to craft the darn thing, and it's a thing of extreme beauty. And so I don't think he really did that for money. He did it because he was compelled to create and to try to be perfect and to communicate to others. And those higher values, I think, are always more intriguing and interesting than just making a buck or doing what your boss says. I don't have to tell you or Simon, because, you guys are the Philosophists, you have other jobs, but this is what interests you. You find this to be more meaningful than your career per se.
It's an interesting one. It kind of, even philosophy, I thought, that's not particularly, something that's going to be a big interest of mine. And just, it's so accessible these days, with a lot of people producing a lot of content. That's very easy to consume. And you kind of slide into it, and you're like, oh God, while I'm here, I've just discovered this is actually much more useful than I thought. I thought it would be a whole load of intellectualizing and, nice wine and crackers and sipping coffee and just doing interesting things with your beard. But it's
I think I have a quote for that.
It seems to transcend that.
See.
I
think I have a quote. Let me tell you this quote by Bertrand Russell. Philosophy, though unable to tell us with certainty what is the true answer to the doubts which it raises, is able to suggest many possibilities which enlarge our thoughts and free them from the tyranny of custom. So I'm not sure exactly how useful that is in that one sense of the word, like utility, but it's certainly true that philosophy is not, boring, foolishly abstruse, abstract in the extreme. Now, philosophers have tried throughout much of the 20th century to make it such, by analyzing the heck out of language and all this type of stuff. And it's just, there's a quote, something like, empty is the argument of the philosopher, which does not solve some problem, or actually the quote ends with, eases some suffering. So empty is the argument of the philosopher, which does not ease some suffering. And so, my philosophy and my psychology, I'm not a psychologist or a philosopher, but I like them both and have spent some time studying them both. And it's always applied in my opinion. The part of it that interests me is the application of those principles. If I were to have to be a mathematician doing basic math or whatever, theoretical math or whatever, that would not interest me in any way, shape, or form, because that's just not how I'm built, and it's not going to help me as soon as I leave the office, or leave the ivory tower. But I happen to be interested in two things that I think are particularly useful when it comes to some of these big and important things in life, and that's psychology and philosophy. If they weren't useful, I probably wouldn't be interested in them.
Yeah, and you brought in there, first of all, your love of quotes. You have quite a lot of quotations built up, and we might get to that. But on the philosophy stuff, I suppose, do you think philosophy is even summarizable in one word? And maybe the other question that just jumped into my head there, just so we don't forget, is, do you have any preference in those eras? You talked about the philosophy or the philosophers in the last century compared with maybe the ancient Greeks. Do you have more of an affection for maybe that more ancient wisdom? Do you think there's something more concrete? Maybe we could start there. And
I do like that era that you referenced, the ancient Greek. For some reason, Athens, Greece, in negative 500, 400, 300 was so interesting, and you sort of can hardly believe that it was real. I mean, if you study Greek culture, it's so interesting. Of course, Rome is fascinating too, but it's, people have examined the Athenian culture, and specifically because it's kind of like, how did philosophy even get started there? If you think about it, the Hebrews and the Egyptians, Indians, these people were, their societies, their civilizations are older than Athens, Greece, in that Periclean era, like I said, negative 400. But as rich as the Old Testament is, and the Talmud and the Upanishads in India and so on and so forth, it's not exactly philosophy. Philosophy is interesting because you do not rely on answers that have been provided to you from your elders. It's kind of like math or physics in that sense, that a 20-year-old can produce something of amazing worth and merit that took great difficulty to achieve. Einstein, his hair was pure black when he came up with the theory of relativity, special theory of relativity, on and on and on. He was not 75 with the crazy white hair. He was a young man. And so the relevance of that point to philosophy is that you can come up with something that nobody else has come up with conceivably in your 20s, and nobody in the field of philosophy should be telling you that's not how it's done here at Harvard or wherever. We don't do it like that, or what you did was not good enough. It's supposed to be purely merit based. No matter how young you are, no matter how black, brown, Asian, whatever you are, you should be able to come up with something, and it should stand on its own 2 feet. Like the best of science is purely meritocratic, and your reputation is not supposed to mean as much in those fields as it does in other fields. So I just like Athens. It's so interesting. How did philosophy get started right then and right there? It's got something to do with the Greek culture for sure. I don't think it's a coincidence, but it kind of belies easy explanation as to how it got started there. And then like I said, in the 20th century, philosophers kind of dropped the ball a little bit and became, myopic about we have to analyze the heck out of language, and just to bring it into modern applications. I also think it's interesting the way that nowadays political progressives or liberals, they get very upset about the use of certain words. It kind of reminds me of the way the philosophers used to get absolutely obsessed with what's called the analytic functions of philosophy. And it's not the highest that one can attain, either in philosophy or in political progressivism, to worry about whether or not somebody has used a pronoun that you find not to be your preferential pronoun or whatever. It's not something to go to the mattresses over, to have a Twitter storm about, in my humble opinion.
I think, as I said, I think it was Wittgenstein and that, and others that really, many of them before him went to town, as he said, on looking at language and analyzing language and breaking it down into a very rigid formulaic thing. I suppose Socrates in that was always keen on getting definitions for terms up front, and always wanted and always asked people, his interlocutors, to define terms for him. So if they were arguing over something, he would say, well, define that thing, define justice, define this. But there does seem to be something different. What he is doing, it seems more looking at a root cause. It's very different from what philosophy in the last 100 years maybe has looked at 150 years.
Yeah, I kind of stand corrected now that I see you make that comparison. I guess in my gut, I sense a qualitative difference between the Socratic method and what Socrates was up to, and then, the type of philosophy that would be called analytic in the kind of a 20th century phenomenon. I guess I'd have to think a lot more or read something on how it was different, because it feels like I just criticized the Socratic method, but yet I don't have a intuitive feeling that that's correct. So, but just to kind of clarify what you were getting at is that, Socrates would go around ancient Athens and act like a gadfly, which is essentially a horsefly, and, basically bite people. And he would, his interest in the subject was ostensibly to determine, what is wisdom in the largest sense of the word. And then beneath that, what does it mean to be just? And, what is true? What is truth? Do we know if the gods exist? All these deeply important questions. And as you say, he wouldn't just let a word slide. If somebody said, what is justice? And they gave a, 25 word answer, he wouldn't say, oh, well, cheerio, excellent. Have a nice day. He would definitely stick with them, defensive tackle, and just be like, no, I'm not going to let you get away with that answer. That's not the ultimate answer, and here's why. And then he would begin to critique what they had said. So obviously a genius, kind of annoying, the epilogue is they put him to death.
Yeah, the end. I don't think, I wouldn't say like I wouldn't say you stood correct at your previous point at all. I think it was very valid what you said. It was just something different. There's something real like applied about what Socrates was doing, and similar people at that time maybe that came after him, the Plato's and that.
I will say that these guys in the 20th century, and they were guys, they were not analyzing the nature of justice for the purposes of determining, what social justice means, for the purposes of determining who gets what and what honor means, and all these types of deeply important socio-political types of questions. They were just sort of like stuck in the weeds, and they would argue back and forth about, minutia. So in Socrates was looking at these things from the broadest perspective, and he was one of the first to do this, which is, it's almost like, you have a scythe, the harvesting tool, and you arrive at a field that's 1,000 acres, and the wheat is tall, go for it, whack, whack, whack. He was one of the first people to be interested in asking these questions from the perspective of philosophy. So, the Hebrews would ask themselves what is just, that's true, but they would not really necessarily think that the answer was a humanistically bound answer. They would think, well, what does God say the answer to that question is? And that's a very different thing.
Just turning to the quotes that you reference, you have many of them at your disposal. You have a searchable quote database on your website, which is very impressive in that you might Google nature and philosophical quotes, and the reason you might do that is something along the lines of you're trying to put some picture on Instagram and you want something smart to go with it, and you realize in that moment, I'm not smart enough. let's try the internet, and you tend to get back the same cliched things, and they're cliched for a reason, because they're obviously brilliant and they're what's risen to the fore. But when I did some searches on your website, and you can mention the domain name. I don't want it on my conscience that I got it wrong. You can mention it now. But you don't get back just those real kind of top tier ones, the first ones that appear in a search engine. You get a great variety, and sometimes even from, I don't have a good example here, but sometimes from people that have been quoted a lot, other quotes from them, but not necessarily these ones. I suppose how did that quote database come around, and the interest in it and the scale of it?
Yeah. So how much time do you have?
We'll see.
When I was a counselor when I was younger. And so in working with clients, nothing seems to hit as hard as bringing up the right quote at the right time. But it's hard to memorize quotes. In fact, my memory of quotes is probably no better than anybody else's. So I think one day I was trying to discuss honor with somebody. I tried to remember how to quote somebody on the subject of honor, and it didn't quite come out right. And so that was the beginning of a obsession with quotations, collecting them, reading them, putting them into books, thinking about them, and then rinse and repeat. Literally, I was there. I was like, you know what? I've got that quote written down in my folder of handwritten notes and stuff. I got to find it. And once I found it, I realized I came across a lot of other quotes that I thought were also good. And so I was like, I'm going to digitize it. And so started typing and typing and typing and typing. And, you can obviously copy and paste some off of the internet, but if you see something in a newspaper, you got to type it. And obviously I had to type all the quotes in my folder. And then of course, being a little bit of an obsessive compulsive kind of person, once I had them typewritten, I was like, well, there's a lot more out there, and they need to be organized and searchable and all this stuff, because, if you're chasing perfection, you try to make the quote database bigger, better, and more diverse and more interesting, and yada, yada, yada. So I basically, took all the quotes and try to fit them into a structure. And I tried to make, miscellaneous, only maybe 5% of the quotes. I wanted everything else to fit into one of these value sets, is what I call them. It's a grouping of values that are somehow slightly related to each other, a 2 or 3 part, a duo or a trio. So creativity, ingenuity, and vision is one. You can kind of see how they would be related to each other. And then wisdom, education, and knowledge is another. You can kind of see how those are related to each other. And I'm probably missing 150 values or synonyms for values. But I think I'm able to collect I can fit most of the quotes that I consider to be good, the kind that kind of get your brain going a little bit, make you kind of excited. I can fit those into this particular structure. And so, if somebody were to go to valuesofthewise.com, up at the top, they would see a resources, on the bar up there, it's resources. If you hover over resources, you get to see 5 different things that you can do on the site, excluding my books. And one of them is called Searchable Quotations Database. You click on that, you go into the search engine. I call it the Wisdom Archive, just immodestly. And there are many fields you can use. You can search by keyword, but then you can refine that by searching by keyword, and then you can do one of four things if you wish. You could specify one of the value sets. So another one would be fulfillment, meaning, and optimism. Like, let's say you're looking for a quote that has the word joy in it, and you want to just choose from the quotes that I consider to be about fulfillment, meaning, and optimism. You specify that. You can specify the author if you're so inclined. It's not how one typically would do it, but I probably have, I don't know, 10,000 authors or something. You could choose one of them if you wanted. Like, let's say you want all the Abraham Lincoln quotes or something like that. Then the gender, this is kind of dating me, because I realized that when I put this together, I only chose male and female as the two genders possibilities, but I'm probably going to be tweeted about in a nasty way, because it makes it seem like I'm excluding other aspects of gender. But I mean, no offense. I just think it's almost kind of odd to say, starting with ancient Egypt up to today, all these quotes, it's like somebody who's transgender, it's just not going to be a large portion of some of those quotes that have kind of stood the test of time or that are currently interesting. Now, can somebody call me out and be like, yeah, but you know what? There is a philosopher or a psychologist or a writer or whoever, activist, and guess what? They are, non-binary or whatever the term would be. That's fair. I'll take the criticism on that. I mean, no offense. And then ethnicity is the fourth thing that you use to characterize your quote search. And again, probably could be criticized for not slicing it finely enough, but it is what it is. So you could search for words you can search for quotes that involve the word joy, let's say, for females, those who could be considered African or Asian or Mexican, Central, South American. That's one of the categories. And so, hit the search button, within a second, you'll get your answer. And it's kind of fun to tinker with this quote database, because indeed I can get something today and put it in there. I read it today. It was from a, think piece right up on the web, from today's date, and boom, I can put it in the database. And now it's in there with, the Confucius and the Aristotle and David Hume and Bertrand Russell quotes. I find it interesting. And there is a kind of a bit of a meritocracy to it. So, for example, there are Bertrand Russell quotes in there, whom many of your listeners would know as a gargantuan name in the field of philosophy. But maybe somebody who's only 17, what's her name? Amanda Gorman, I think is her name. She was the one who did an incredible spoken word performance at the Biden inauguration. I mean, she came out of nowhere in my opinion. And some of the stuff she said is quite quotable. So I'll put it up there with, Einstein, Gandhi, and Henry David Thoreau, because if it has merit, it has merit. Then again, I can probably listen to Tucker Carlson for 48 hours straight, and I won't find anything said by him that I think qualifies as true, authentic wisdom. And so it ain't going to find its way into the database.
It's a great or interesting or unusual segue to go from that last sentence or two into I'll bring you back to the question of what is wisdom. Which and maybe what is a great quote? What I think you've enumerated them already, but maybe it'd be nice to maybe even bring these two things together. Is almost all wisdom, great wisdom, quotable?
I will do a bit of shameless plugging here and say the book has literally over 1,500 quotations in it. Now, some of them I did line up based on the chapter. At the end of a chapter, I'll just put quote after quote after quote, kind of like, here you go. You heard me talk for an hour, and now I'd like you to see some diversity of opinion and maybe a little bit of backup for my opinions. But I also pepper I guess my style is, you can see how I studied psychology. I kind of like to cite people as I write. So I'll say, this reminds me of what so-and-so said, and then I'll go research, exactly what they said, put it in there. Here's an interesting research finding. quote, stuff like that. So I guess it's the second part of your question. I will say, if somebody were to buy the book, and it does go on sale once every 30, 40, 50 days, you can get more quotes about wisdom than you can imagine, or than you would ever really probably need in that book. And so, it's kind of like a reach into the hat and pull out a quote about wisdom. I mean, there's just countless ones. Here, I'll give you a couple. We learn wisdom from failure much more than we do from success. We often discover what we'll do by finding out what will not do. And probably he who never makes a mistake never made a discovery. That's Samuel Smiles. And here's one by Yuval Noah Harari. He's a modern writer. Questions you cannot answer are usually far better for you than answers you cannot question. I find, to some degree, to answer your question about what is wisdom, I find something to be wisdom at that top level of analysis if, when you've read it, you get a little bit of a dopamine squirt, your brain's like, aha, love that. If ever you say, oh, I love that, and it could be a song, or it could be something that somebody said at a bus stop, whatever. If your reaction is, okay, head nod, like it, beautiful, beautiful. I love what you said there. That's you sensing the wisdom in what they say. Because if they were to say something banal, you'd be like, okay, yeah, all right, well, hey, I got to go. Nice talking to you. It wouldn't really resonate. Or if somebody tells you a lie, it's really hard for me to watch Fox News and listen to some of the stuff that goes on in MAGA world, which is sort of a way to describe much of America, and I guess many parts of Europe too, because there are so many lies. And I think the proper reaction when you hear a lie should be that, it should sound dissonant to you and disturbing. You should be like, wait a second, that's not true. That can't be true. Now, that's not to say that everybody knows everything already. I'm a firm believer in the fact that we don't know everything. So go look it up. In the old days, you would look it up in an encyclopedia to try to find out the answer. Now Google's a source. That aside, when somebody like, Rudy Giuliani uttered one day in his inimitable style, he exclaimed, truth is not truth. And I just couldn't quite believe what I was hearing, because it's like, truth is not truth. What the flip does that mean? It's illogical, it's foolish. And it's, you can sense the chicanery in that, because why is he doing this? He's doing this because he's carrying Trump's water, wants to overturn an election. So wisdom is sort of like the opposite of that feeling you get when you're like, wait, that's complete nonsense. No. I guess other ways to describe wisdom would be it's inner knowing, like inner hyphen knowing, is in when you truly deeply get something and feel something. It's probably wisdom, with an asterisk, because we always must check what we feel against reality. So, you can't just sit there on Facebook and be like, I feel this guy is an idiot, and I'm going to tell him because that's how I feel, because you may be barking up the wrong tree, going down the wrong path, just kind of rehearsing your prejudices. That's a quote somebody once said. Most people, when they're thinking, what they're really doing is just rearranging their prejudices. And so that's a startling look at how you can feel things and have this inner knowing, and you can truly resonate with rich, beautiful, time-honored things, but you can also feel like, do you remember the story of this woman who was in Central Park in New York? She had a little bit of a row with this African-American jogger or whatever. And so she decided that the path to take would be to call 911 and say, quote, there's a black man who's bothering me right now. And literally she was holding her dog up by his leash at the time, because she was sort of mindlessly stuck in some sort of strange relationship with this black man and had forgotten that she was walking her dog. And so her pug is like, you're killing me. But what came to her was, I'm going to call 911 on your ass, and I'm going to tell them that you're a black guy and that you've been threatening me. And now that's particularly repugnant from the moral sense, but it's also interesting from the wisdom aspect, because it's like that's where she went. Obviously, the brain moves at the speed of light, right? Maybe not the speed of light, but it's an incredibly fast calculation machine, and we have evolution to thank for that. And so we can get things wrong, and we can get them wrong very quickly. Road rage. Obviously, if you're experiencing road rage, you're like, that son of a cut me off. And now you're angry, and now you want that person to be punished, and blah blah blah. But it's not really wisdom, because you're just experiencing emotions, maybe adrenaline, whatever. So you've always got to check things that come to you, especially through intuition. Check them and make sure that you are truly dealing with truth and wisdom there, and not just dealing with some sort of what's called cognitive bias. Confirmation bias is one of the most pernicious and popular biases now, and that's essentially where you are looking something up on the internet or who knows where, listening carefully to what somebody's saying, and you really only attach your attention to those things that you are wanting to find, the things you already believe. You're looking for confirmation more than truth per se. And you can see this with anti-vaxxers and whatever. They'll look something up and they'll wait until they find it. If they haven't found it yet, they'll keep looking, and they'll dismiss counter evidence and alternative points of view, and to some degree, in my opinion, truth, in order to find that one little sliver of news reporting or opinion that excites them. And then they're like, aha, got it. Okay, copy, paste, boom, done. That's just confirmation bias. That's not real truth seeking.
Yeah, and I think it's probably a good point to get into the book a bit more. I've read maybe up to about half of it. I'm not exactly sure, but really enjoyed what I read and found it very interesting. I thought there was great overlap maybe between our philosophy here and the Philosophists podcast, because it's a book that it's not heavy to read. It's one, I found it's something where I think bringing in those quotes at the right time just makes it quite readable as you go through it, and breaks it up a lot. In a way, I think if someone's listening to this, it's certainly worth checking out, because it's not targeted, I think it's fair to say it, at a dry academic audience. It's much more general. It's much more for the everyday person who wants to get just both an enjoyable read about wisdom and to learn something, and maybe challenge themselves a little bit as well, and maybe opinions and things like that they'll encounter. Would that be a fair summary, do you think?
Yeah, that's nice. I like what you say. I've sort of mused that there's something in this book to offend everyone, because it's 390 something pages, and every page, I'm not phoning it in on any page. Every page I worked hard on, and I probably brought in a little bit of research from psychology or a personal growth truth, or I might cite a philosopher or something like this. In 400 pages, I probably give 1,000 opinions or make 1,000 claims or try to communicate what I consider to be a true, justifiably, correct fact. And so not everybody's going to see it like that. To some degree, I think everybody has a right to view my book or any point I make however they want. They could say, this guy's insane, or whatever. Now we could argue about it, and I will argue from my point of view, but you can think about each of my points, what you think about them. However, I think that the best arguments are those that have the most evidence on their side. So if I make a claim and I have made a mistake, then you'll be able to find evidence to refute what I've said. And in that case, it should be incumbent upon me to admit that the person's correct and try to change it if I have another edition that comes out. Anyway, I was just thinking that I got a review online, Amazon review. Somebody said, this person has so many quotes. It's like full of quotes. It's crowded with quotes. I get tired of reading the quotes. And so it's just interesting because, you read the next review, somebody will say, I love those quotes. They're wonderful. How did he find all these? They're just put there just so eloquently and beautifully. And so, with a subject like wisdom or philosophy, it's so broad and so able to be, it's like a mountain that has, 1,000 paths up it. You can be on a walkie-talkie walking up that mountain. You turn and you say, here's what I see from this mountain. What do you see? Over. And somebody will say, I don't see that, but you're on the same mountain. You're just on the opposite side of the mountain, or you're higher on the mountain than they are, or your vision is better, or you have a cloud and it's, you know what I mean? So wisdom is wisdom and truth is truth. And these things are relatively stable and long lasting, but different people think differently about things. And it's you have to here's an example of wisdom. You have to balance. I'm always trying to get a type of a balance in the book. You have to balance the desire to support yourself and to be confident, self-confident, and to say, this is what I think, and here's where I stand, and yada, 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 and not be swayed by both, because there's a lot of it out there in society. On the other hand, you can't just do that, because if you just do that, you will stay static. You'll never change. You'll think, I already know everything I need to know. All I need to do is defend myself against, interlocutors who think differently or who need to be crushed by me. The opposite of that is to think, like Socrates used to say, I don't really know. I'm not. Now there's kind of a question about how honest he was being when he said that, but let's take him at his word. Let's say he didn't really know this, that, or the other. It's a type of a humility, and that is where a lot of wisdom can be found, to just sort of start from scratch. Just listen to what the other person has to say. Just look it up online and just start from scratch. Just kind of pretend or accept that you don't know something, or that you're not sure, or that you could be wrong, and start from there. If you can balance those two things in a kind of a type of a dialectic, it'll be the best route forward. It's kind of like firm, like when you grip a tennis racket, you grip it firmly because you don't want the racket to come out of your hand as soon as you hit the ball, but you're always changing positions slightly. You're not causing your knuckles to be white with an intense grip. You're able to you might even switch hands. You might rotate it real quick. So be firm but flexible when it comes to how you determine these values that you have, and what's true, what's false, what's worth aspiring to, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think you have a quote. I think it's page 149 in your book. Somehow I managed to get the page numbers out of the unusual way I'm reading with audio software to the book. I think it's Height. I'm not clear on the pronunciation I should use. I probably should be better than that, but I presume it's Jonathan Haidt. And co-author Greg Lukianoff have two suggestions on this topic. Argue as if you're right, but listen as if you're wrong, and be willing to change your mind. So I think that's quite a good way of looking at staying kind of malleable. You can certainly argue your point, but don't
you're right.
out. Yeah, don't drown out those other things. So that was one of the quotes I found was quite hadn't come across before, and quite impactful.
There's also a Bertrand Russell quote: "The extent to which beliefs are based on evidence is very much less than believers suppose."
Right.
You can see why he wrote an essay called "Why I Am Not a Christian." He made a habit out of just absolutely starting from scratch. What do I know? Almost like a Cartesian. I'm only going to believe what I absolutely can find evidence for, and cannot find much counter evidence for. And that requires a lot of mental discipline. Philosophy is not meant for geniuses only. It's not something that you have to have a degree or PhD in order to, quote, do it. But I will say that you can easily go down rabbit holes, make massive mistakes that you stick with for your lifetime. I mean, I live in North Carolina. There's a lot of Confederate flags here. It's like Confederate flags. The Confederacy lost that war in 1865, and it wasn't really a very good position to be holding, because you were fighting for the right to hold slaves. So you still believe in the Confederacy, and you're flying your flag and telling people who drive by and who are not part of your group, basically to, where to stick it. I mean, it's just very, very antiquated. So philosophy has a lot to do with constantly updating what you know and what you think your beliefs and your axioms, and it's not complicated. It's a little complicated, but more so it is a tireless process.
Yeah, and maybe just while you've brought us to that area, I think you have a quote in there. It's around I think it's page 20. America is experiencing its adolescence. I don't know if that's a quote, actually. I don't quote Marx, so I think it's something you wrote in the book rather than quoting anyone other than yourself. Is there something there? I might have caught you in the hop here, but is there something there that maybe what do you mean? You probably alluded to some of it already, but.
Yeah, so I tend to feel like there is sufficient evidence to make a claim like that and to say that America is an ailing society. And I think adolescence refers to the fact that we have potential to grow into adulthood as a society, but we're not there yet. And it's interesting to think that adolescence neurologically means that the adolescent's brain is not fully developed. Maybe some listeners don't know this, but the human brain is not fully developed until the mid-20s if everything goes well. Obviously, some people have retarded development because of nutritional problems or trauma or something genetic or whatever. But if everything goes well, a teenager is not fit to make certain decisions because they just don't have the capacity at age 13 through 20 something. Now, obviously, some people are in their 80s and they're still, extremely problematic in their development. But so that I think the idea of adolescence refers to the fact that America is relatively young and we've had a kind of a amazing start. A lot that's great goes on in America, but we have such huge problems. The lack of wisdom that is inherent in our culture is glaringly obvious. And I think a lot of people would realize that if they just kind of thought about it. But they usually don't think with the word wisdom. They don't think about wisdom, I guess is a good way to say that. So they don't really think of America as being unwise, but we just aren't really very wise. I mean, I would even challenge somebody to prove me wrong and show me how America is wise and how we value wisdom and how we've achieved metaphoric adulthood and how we're great and we're everything we need to be and the future is bright. I mean, it can't be done.
Yeah. Do you think there's a relationship? There are different things, wisdom and common sense. Do you think there's a relationship between them? Is it even possible to define common sense? But maybe the question ends up being, does America have a problem with common sense? Is there a lack of common sense in America?
Common sense. I mean, Americans often cite common sense. They'll say the person's book smart, but they're not street smart, or they just don't have good common sense or whatever. And so I think in a way they're referring to like a practical type of wisdom, like wisdom where the rubber meets the road. And so I think it's fair in a way to say that Americans try to gather wisdom as they go through life, and the things that we all agree on as being wisdom might be called common sense. So I think there's something to that. But as long as many, many, many millions of Americans don't even get that global warming is a thing, we're really not very sensical in that common sense kind of a way. They're just shooting from the hip and they're parroting what they hear on the news and what their uncle tells them. And it's just absolutely backwards and it could exact a tremendous cost. As if that, I'm yelling, as if they don't know that already. I mean, show me an American who hasn't experienced a weather phenomenon that is mind-blowing. I mean, the fires that we've had, the droughts, the hurricanes, the rising tides. I mean, good God, you'd have to take some Americans by the hair and show them the rising seas and, virtually drown them. Be like, do you see the seas rising? Do you see it? Can you get that it's rising? It's rising. You know what I mean? So to some degree, there's a common sense problem in America. To another degree, I would say that Americans do value common sense and don't necessarily, give undue credence to people who have achieved, advanced degrees or who are prestigious or whatever. So
there's common sense. It just needs to be more common, and then that would
and more of it. Hopefully there will be more of it, because the degree to which most Americans really get wisdom and behave wisely, it's not impressive stuff. Now, I'm not saying that I'm wiser than the average person, right? Because I've studied wisdom for quite some time, but I'm not saying that I am Mr. Self-actualized. I am the best of the best. I'm the smartest of the smart. I know everything. Wisdom is, child's play to me. That's not the case. I realize how complex it all is, but some people, they kind of don't really realize how complex it all is. They think that they have it all down. It's obvious that that's not the case, which reminds me of an interesting quote. Einstein said something really cool once. Einstein is obviously a really swift guy. He said, understanding physics is child's play compared to understanding a child's play. I mean, that's actually so complex, it's hard to grasp in a way. He's saying physics is challenging, right? He's a genius. He's a genius in physics, but he thinks that's child's play compared to understanding a child and a child at play. Why does a child play? How does their little brain develop such that they understand so much so quickly? You can see interesting things when you watch a child play. The competitiveness, the cooperativeness, the curiosity, the darker emotions like anger, selfishness. So Einstein is basically saying, physics is extremely complex, but guess what? Understanding the human mind and the human brain is even more complex. So I've always found that to be kind of I've taken a bit of pride in that, because this is the thing that interests me the most. The thing that Einstein said is more complex than physics.
Yeah, that's a great example. I'm interested to bring us back to maybe the common sense thing and finish it out, because it's something I've never really gotten to talk about much. It's sort of been in the back of my mind. There's something maybe to be said around kind of communication or knowledge that's implicit versus explicit. So communication that maybe isn't said, and if it isn't said, where does that knowledge reside? And maybe a practical example might make this more useful, I think. So in Ireland, if you look back to the previous generations, the ones that are maybe grandparent age now, and if you keep going back maybe even a little bit further in time, you might see two people of that generation communicating, and they might say a few things, like a few words. Maybe it's something as simple as, do you want a cup of tea? I don't know. And the other person kind of has this implied wink or nod that conveys, like, it's not just a yes. There was a lot of implicit language and knowing in the group. Two people might meet each other from that generation, and instead, they might just literally bump into each other, and may not have seen each other for 6 months, and they would just nod, and it's a knowing nod. Like, it's not like they don't care about each other. They may care deeply about each other. They might be from the same locality. They might have had a lot of time spent together growing up, but they don't bump into each other and just start, spilling words everywhere. Maybe that's because there's an awful lot of the context already built into the culture. Maybe because there isn't that many ways for that culture to be in a more constrained Ireland if we went back 50 years or whatever. By comparison, maybe in somewhere like the US, where it has been much less constrained in terms of, it was a frontier country, and things can really evolve in radical positive and radical negative maybe directions. There isn't that constraining. So I get the impression sometimes that maybe things have to be explicit because you can't take something for granted. And because you can't take things for granted in the culture, there's less maybe what you might call common sense, because there can't be common sense because it's just so diverse. Whereas it's easier to have common sense where you have more of a monoculture. And it's interesting because as you know, as you get older, you kind of you look at people of that generation, that era, and you're like, okay, I am who I am now in my 30s or 40s, whatever. But you're like, okay, as I get older, will I turn into that person? And as you know, now that I'm getting older and arriving there, I'm slowly realizing no, it's kind of it's something you can call it lost, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But a lot of that implicit knowledge, that implicit way of communicating, and the common sense that went with it, has that was taken for granted. I think that's something that's going, but it's replaced with a lot of positive things, and maybe Ireland and many European countries, of course, and just in my experience here in Ireland, that kind of quiet knowing nod is on the way out, and it's being replaced with something much more explicit. Maybe the last thing I'm saying is if you watch two stereotypical American characters in a movie meeting each other, and it's in a movie, they'll be like, oh, I love you, man, and how are you doing? Oh my God, how are you doing? And it's like this exclamation of incredible surprise, and they may have met that morning already, in stark contrast to the previous example where people may have not met each other for a long time, and there's a different way of being with each other. So I'm not sure that's a long lead into a question around common sense, but I think I could sum it up with maybe monoculture and homogeneity of a culture versus more diversity. And maybe the question is common sense possible when you have that much variance culturally?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's roiling Europe now and feeding the far right extremism is the influx of immigrants. Humanity is extremely heterogeneous and diverse and so on. And so having a bunch of people come to your country that don't look like you, don't talk like you, are different in so many ways, at least ostensibly they're different, it leads to a sense of unease the more a culture deals with this diversity. Some people probably think that one of America's problems is its great diversity, having everybody try to get together in maybe, let's say, a salad metaphor. They're all crowding each other out in the same bowl and competing for scarce resources and envious of each other and abusing each other and all this different type of stuff. And it adds a layer of complexity to have that kind of heterogeneity. I think one of the reasons that some of the Nordic countries do so well is because they don't have as many problems endemic to the society. And I've heard that be related to the homogeneity of that culture. Now, I'm not trying to say that if everybody in a culture is white, that things are going to be great. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying if you put a lot of people into a mix and resources are scarce, you're going to have some problems. And that's probably one of the things that goes on in America. One thing I was thinking as you were talking was, in some societies, maybe American Indian would be one that I'm thinking of. The fact that elders are respected, I think, is a type of acknowledgement of common sense. The fact that people who are older seem wiser, they've had more experience, life has beaten them up a little bit, and they've sort of achieved and kind of been winnowed by life, and therefore they kind of get a certain degree of respect that modern Americans just don't give to elderly people. In fact, here in America, I think we can sometimes get criticized for not really seeing wisdom in people who are older or elderly. We kind of look past them because we're sort of obsessed with the new and the inventive and the cutting edge and all these types of things. And so it's probably not a surprise that we have a lot of inventions and patents and higher education here and so on and so forth, but not a lot of respect for elders. And if you've ever been to a facility where old folks live, it's pretty obvious that we don't particularly value those people. And it can be shocking because we have, problems in America with kids having enough attention from adults and being taught to read and other subjects successfully. and deal with, problems that they are experiencing as children, as teens. And yet you have these elderly people who are sitting in I wouldn't say assisted living, because they're probably kind of out to pasture at that point, but folks who are just kind of watching television a lot and playing shuffleboard and cards and whatever. Those people it would seem like a beautiful match between young people who could ideally respect the wisdom of elders and elderly people who could naturally want to help the young and the misguided and the troubled. But for some reason, it doesn't quite hit. It's like we're not firing on all cylinders in that sense.
Do you have faith? Do you faith that a balance will, in all these things, be found eventually, that it is possible to get a society that has the inventiveness and also at the same time have the kind of social conscience and the ability to, because there's a balance with wisdom. I mean, not that there's a balance with wisdom. Sorry, I misspoke. There's a balance with like respect for elders. The respect should be there for the elders. Whether there should be respect for every idea, the ideas that those elders cherished is a different question, of course. And we should be respectful to the fact, I suppose, that, in at least in many cases, that they're the values they held, they're the things they thought about. And we might then disagree and say they were actually, in many cases, terrible ideas. I mean, in Ireland, the history of how women have been treated in Ireland is pretty shocking, and quite draconian would be a generous term if you go back into the past, and how things happened around for mothers and children, and maybe different factors, how that came to be, the interplay between state and religion, and how that all cashed out in a country that was finding its feet after going its own way. So it's not to say that the ideas and the traditions that were there we have to value those ideas and respect them and say we can't rail against them. But I think, do you faith that we can keep respect for the elders at the same time as maybe politely or forcefully rejecting their ideas while we're in dialogue with them, and the bigger social integration?
I will say that I don't believe that it's true that wisdom necessarily improves with age. That is to say that a 99-year-old person is not necessarily wiser than a 70-year-old person, who is not necessarily wiser than a 50-year-old person. I get into some of that in my book, and I kind of took my cue from Stephen S. Hall in his book, which is interesting because it's kind of a misnomer. So I wish that we would learn to respect wisdom more than some sort of a outward status. You can think of an old person, a white person, a physician, a wealthy person, a beautiful person, all these different types of things. They might get kind of a special ride, get a little bit of a extra credence just by virtue of having that status, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's really absolutely true. So for example, there's a kind of a bias where we tend to think that people who are respected in society in that sense of higher status tend to have everything correct. If you're a physician, you seem to have like a halo, almost like an angel would have a halo, where just by virtue of being a physician, not only do you know medicine, but you know a lot of other stuff too. And interestingly, in real estate investing, physicians are kind of said to not be that great of investors, maybe for reasons X, Y, or Z. But it would be great to be able to treat people so fairly and so judiciously that we don't give certain people either short shrift or special privileges just because of a status. And it's very difficult. Research findings show that people who are beautiful, they just have a halo, and it's amazing. You just kind of like them, and you just kind of trust them, and you just kind of whatever. And it's not necessarily the case that they are anything else but beautiful. And frankly, the idea of being beautiful also is a relative term, because some people might think, I don't know, like if you can show a picture of somebody's beautiful to an African who lives, in Papua New Guinea, whatever, they might be like, that person is ugly. They don't even have any rings on stretching their neck or whatever, you know what I mean? But they don't have huge earlobes or whatever. So beauty is truly in the eye of the beholder in that one sense. But in America at present, people who are this, that, and this tend to be thought of as, let's say, wiser. And, your listeners would be interested, no doubt, to delve into things like some of those social psychological experiments from the past that are so interesting. The first two that are, the biggest, most interesting are the Stanford prison experiment, Stanford prison study, and Stanley Milgram's obedience to authority experiments. You can go down a rabbit hole researching either one of those. And there was a wonderful movie made about the prison experiment. It would probably take too long to go into, but they are fascinating, deeply fascinating. And the Milgram experiment about obedience to authority, which admittedly was done in the 60s, I think, in America, does still hold true to some degree, that if there's a person in a white coat who's telling you to do something, meaning a respected member of an institution or a physician or what have you, you tend to kind of want to err on the side of obeying their authority. And it's very interesting because we do have an authority problem here in America. One of the main things that describes Trump fans, Trump voters, I'm talking about people, as of this taping, there are still a huge number of Americans who think that Trump is some sort of a god, and it's shocking. One of the things that they tend to have in common, more or less, I won't say that they are bigoted or whatever. What I will say is that they tend to think in an authoritarian way. And authoritarianism is, I'm not talking politically, Mussolini. I don't mean authoritarian in that sense, but psychologically, there's a personality characteristic called authoritarianism. And that's interesting. It's also genetic in part, which leads to the interesting factoid that politics, your political views, are somewhat genetic in their origin. And so obviously there's no gene for liberalism or gene for conservatism. What there is personality predispositions toward things like authoritarianism. Those types of people tend to be conservative politically, and there tends to be, a panoply of things that characterize them and that they believe and that they get involved in, and so on and so forth. So Trump is extremely authoritarian. Many of his sycophantic followers are authoritarian as well. And it's like a mutual admiration society. He admires them, they admire him, and boom, it's like a match made in heaven. They're going to stick with each other come hell or high water.
What could go wrong? We might return to that again. I'd like to circle back to you did mention real estate there, and maybe the physicians and the investing on real estate, that mightn't be they mightn't always make the best decisions. Without any data in front of me, I'll just take that at face value. I want to turn it back maybe a little bit again, just kind of curiosity, maybe from the Irish context of in Ireland, maybe because there was kind of a lot of small farms and agriculture, especially when historically and particularly, it was a big thing as Ireland regained its independence. There was a very strong kind of connection to the land, and it seems to be something that's hung on in there in the psyche. Like house prices in many places in the world, of course, are always flying up and things like that. But there seems to be something in the identity that kind of ties in with Irish culture and wanting to own your own house. Sometimes what may seem at any cost, almost figuratively and literally. I just want to use that kind of intro to frame real estate and philosophy and tapping into that identity and home. Is there anything there that jumps at you that you see an overlap between wisdom and real estate?
I probably would just say that I don't know that much about real estate from one side of things, but from the investing side of things, I've spent some time delving into that. And when you read a book about real estate investing, the author is trying to share with you wisdom. They're trying to say, I've been through a lot in my career, taken some hard hits, dealt with some bad luck, lost money, lost face, etc. And I'm here to share with you my lessons because it will make you a better investor to know what I know. It'll shorten your learning curve. You can speed forward and not have to make the same mistakes I made. So I think wisdom finds its way into almost everything in investing. It certainly is one of these main virtues that allows a person to say, you know what, I'm not going to invest in that. And here's why. And that could either be kind of intuitive or it can be kind of data based. But I've said no to different projects because of intuition. I've said no to projects because of data. And one of the things about real estate investing and wisdom that's interesting is that if you make an unwise decision in real estate investing, you will be punished. It will hurt. And you will beg the gods of wisdom to give you another chance and to save your ass. And, you swear you'll do it better next time. And that's essentially a type of growing wiser. So, for example, I was involved in a fix and flip project, a house rehab of gnarly proportions. It took a long time. It hurt. It wasn't as profitable as I want. I lost a friend due to it. I was up at night sometimes pacing. It was rough. And it was so clear. Okay, there was bad luck involved, but it's pretty clear that wisdom could have guided me better if I really only listened to it. And my wife now, she says, you're not going to do another flip again, right? Like she's essentially saying, you've encountered enough pain in real estate investing to be wise enough to say, flipping is not really for you, right? And I kind of have to head nod because she's probably right. There are easier ways to make a buck than flipping a house. It could be dangerous, and there are many pitfalls. And I think one aspect of wisdom in real estate investing that's interesting is that you have to know when to be patient and you have to know when to act. There are times when it's like strike while the iron is hot, act now, sign the paper or say yes or do whatever you need to do, boom. And there are times when you need to be patient. And the patience, of course, is 500 times more plentiful than the need to act. You might have a great need to act once a quarter, once a year, once a whatever, depending on what the person is doing. But you have to be patient 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 30 days in a month. And it just seems like it's nothing but patience sometimes in investing. And patience certainly is tied in with wisdom.
Yeah. I suppose I could be accused of overreach here, but if one is to relating it back to my question, I suppose if somebody goes to buy a house, if it's for them to live in it, it's still an investment. It's probably the biggest investment people make, perhaps without sometimes thinking about it. And certainly when, as you said, when that investment goes south and doesn't work out, and things like maybe negative equity creep in, or and that stays during recessions for lot longer than people would ever hope, and then that moment passes. And I think that's something that did happen in Ireland. Hopefully it's passed for most people. I'm not sure, maybe it has or hasn't, but it definitely is in a better position than it needs to be. But I'm pretty sure it has, with the way prices are right now as we speak. But there feels like it's happening all over again, and there isn't, I don't know, it mightn't be a wisdom thing. I think you've one quote in there, I think it's on page 35. You can correct me actually, whether it's a quote or whether it's your own words. Sorry, I don't have it noted, but I did like it. It says, we each tend to grow up doing to others what our parents, teachers, police officers, uncles, institutions, and powerful individuals in society in general did to us. Where the kind of, I don't know, the turn at the end, probably sometimes people are expecting the word made us think or inspired us, but the words there is did to us. And I think it kind of ties in with that inevitability of, if people need a home and need the house, they have to buy it. And if they want certain requirements, they have a family, they have to buy a certain type of house. And it kind of, for me, kind of links in with maybe as well the stuff you were saying, the admiration with Trump and some of his supporters, and the supporters looking up. And it's hard to sometimes say, like, it links in with maybe Foucault or Michel Foucault. where is the power? Where is the oppression? It's not like Trump can single-handedly do what he did, or going back in the past, in terms of people like Mussolini, that things they did, there was factors, there was an interplay between the society at the time that caused them to get there, and then them in turn oppressing down society. There's this interplay, and it's hard sometimes to see where that PowerPoint is that will change the kind of course of history of the narrative. But to bring it all back together, I guess just going back to that quote, what do you think in terms of the systems that are there? Is there an inherent, I don't know, oppression or constraints in society that we're struggling to break out of, that we really should, or that there's some better ways in which we could have some little fault lines that we can detonate, or safety valves to take the pressure off? When in this case, house prices are rising uncontrollably again. There doesn't seem to be a solution to that here. Is that just inevitable?
One thing I think about in regard to real estate that's interesting is that there's a huge disparity between the home ownership rate of white people in America and African Americans, and that's pretty significant. As well, the wealth that African Americans have, their average wealth is much lower. Their health is also much worse on average. So that's kind of an interesting bit of social commentary. Well, I guess I haven't made any commentary, but those are interesting facts, and they lead an open-minded person to draw some conclusions that they're fairly disturbing. I think capitalism has a very pernicious effect on many people, or most people, some of the time, or societies. Now, it's a double-edged sword, because capitalism has also accounted for some great things in society. Obviously, industrialization in England made the world absolutely different in 20 years or 40 years. But you can see the legacy, right? Remember in London, the fact that they would burn coal would leave soot on houses and everywhere else, and obviously, lead to health problems, asthma, blah, blah, blah. And so there's kind of a symbolism there, right? The fact that if you extract some sort of fossil fuel from the earth and burn it, you can get machines to do work for you, but there's probably going to be some sort of a proportional cost to doing so. And clearly, coal is a terrible idea now. Okay, maybe in 1860, coal was a pretty darn good idea. It's a terrible idea now. So there's just a lot of richness there to consider, that capitalism has wrought so much that is problematic, damaging, harmful, and perhaps species ending. And we just don't seem to quite get that. A lot of people in America are just hell-bent on letting capitalism go, let it run freely, because it enriches them, and they're addicted to money, and they don't have good enough values to value integrity highly enough to say, you know what, I don't need as much money as I have. I'm not going to chase a buck. I'm certainly not going to participate in this system of legalized bribery that exists in America now after some horrible Supreme Court decisions like Citizens United. So capitalism it's telling, it's symbolic, there's something about capitalism that is both our friend and our foe, and it needs to be managed successfully, because many of our problems are based on capitalism. Obviously, global warming is one. Politics in America, at least, is another. You were talking about housing prices being just, people don't feel guilty when they sell their house for a profit. They're like, hell yeah, high five, sold that for a lot of money, boom. But it's all just kind of part of a system that can be criticized as being kind of based on money values rather than life values. I'm using those terms. They were introduced to me by Kevin Danaher, a sociologist. I'm not sure where he got them. He might have invented them, but he contrasts money values with life values. And America is pretty good at money values. Not great, because good God, we have a huge amount of debt, and inflation is currently kicking our butt, and so on and so forth. But really would do well to to prioritize life values to a much greater degree than we do. I mean, why people don't have health insurance still, or why daycare is unaffordable to many. There's just certain things that we're doing that are patently foolish, and we just continue to do them. And it does have a lot to do with money, and it's got a lot to do with anti-wisdom. I sometimes use the term anti-wisdom to describe something that's just glaringly unwise. There's just a lot about America that's kind of anti-wise. We really better get it straight before, I mean, good God, Florida could be completely differently shaped in 25 years. And those Floridians who value money, no doubt, living right there on the coasts, they're going to be extremely hard hit by rising seas. I mean, what are you going to do? Throw your money at the ocean and say, back ocean, away foul villain? I mean, there's nothing you can do if the seas are rising except for spend your money to deal with, to either move or put in some seawalls or do X, Y, or Z. But it's so foolish. It's like, get off the addiction to commercialism and money and power, and chase those values that are well known to be better for human beings than some of those values.
Yeah, I think I feel a bit like Sisyphus with the boulder near the top of the mountain. That I'm not sure the time where you are, but we're creeping up the time where my studio will cease to be that, and more turn to a sleeping place. And so I think we've talked about a lot of the problems. I think it's amazing to think. I'm just looking at the notes I made. We've barely scratched the surface of your book, which is truly amazing. We've been talking for well over an hour, probably an hour and a half. I'd like to talk about the maybe just the kind of solutions that maybe sneak out, particularly again some of the quotes, some of the stories in there. The main takeaway you say on page 59 is that wisdom modulates the extremes and thus takes the best of what the two polarities have to offer. Now, I have to admit, I don't have the point prior to that main takeaway. I don't have the book actually in front of me, but I think it stands on its own right there. And it does kind of echo something I think Aristotle used to talk about, this kind of, I think it was a golden mean between extremes. He always looked for compromise, or a kind of a winning compromise. Do you think that, and maybe through philosophy and critical thinking, those three come together to help at least tackle the problems that we've discussed? Or is it just one side is right here? In the majority case, I don't mean perfectly so, but
there are some things that okay, I think about this a lot from the perspective of a person who is politically minded, but also writing on the subject of wisdom, and about whom people can write reviews if they wish, and so on and so forth. So I don't want to be, polemical and overly opinionated and cocky and say, I think I know certain things to be true and correct and right and wise. But there's a lot going on in America now that just is patently, ostensibly, on its face, unwise, or insert whatever adjective you want: foolish, damaging, wrong-headed, hypocritical, whatever. Those things are facts. Obviously, you can argue with me, but the typical Fox News viewer wouldn't be able to argue with me about some of those things. They would say, "Well, I've been hearing that our biggest problem is Biden, or immigration, or debt, or whatever." And it's like, demonstrably, that's not true. Or Tucker Carlson said this, that's my evidence. Well, you kind of have to assess the validity and the strength of evidence. And in so doing, you would find that most of the things he says are not either factual or well-meaning or useful things. It's just propaganda nonsense. So on the one hand, I want liberals and moderates and whatever to say, there's a lot going on that's wrong, that's antithetical to good values, and damn it, it's a fact. Get out there and vote. Tell your truth. Say what's true. On the other hand, some of these things are kind of, you have to tease it out. It's hard to figure out some of these things that are more nuanced. So on the one hand, I would say some Americans are ready to make a statement of fact and say, this is true, this is what I think, this is it, this is my opinion, boom. I'll put it on Facebook, tell my cousin what's up. So I think we need to be a little softer, more hesitant, more modest in that sense, and just kind of slow it down. And that's why I don't have anything to do with Twitter, and I'm virtually never on Facebook and whatever, because That's basically capitalism pulling out of you some of your worst qualities. People get depressed on social media and they get envious and they get angry and hopeless, and they are pulled toward the inane and the superficial. I think I kind of lost track of what question you're asking. Wisdom is always a balance between this and that, the two polarities. It's not to say that always everything, is right in the middle, but, you, in referencing Aristotle, you're pointing out that courage is the virtue, meaning the thing that is sought after. And then cowardice is on one end to be avoided, and rashness or heedlessness is to be avoided on the other, because somebody who is rash, unhinged, too impulsive, they're going to get themselves in trouble. And it's not really courage that they've landed on. They're all the way over on the other end. And of course, with cowardice and timidity and fecklessness and inability to stand up for things, that's not good either. So courage is just right there in the middle. And so in that case, what's in the middle is no doubt correct.
On the kind of mean as it comes together in the middle, sometimes, yeah, it's a question whether the sliders particularly more to one side than the other. Sometimes it's a synthesis of both poles and you actually get something completely new out of it. We're probably not sure exactly what we're going to get next out of the current state that maybe the world is in, but I think there's a quote you have in there, maybe on a positive note. I think it says, a philosopher never gets quite used to the world. To him or her, the world continues to seem a bit unreasonable, bewildering, even enigmatic. So, I think if we can take I think that's on page 28, if we can take the kind of curious and interesting aspects from our current predicament and try and build something positive on them, hopefully it'll lead towards some sort of progress.
Yeah, I mean, the Buddhists and the Stoics, they tend to have something good there in that they don't get overly worked up about the problems of the world. I tend to notice the imperfect in myself and in the world and in my leaders and yada, yada, yada. So it's easy to focus in on what's wrong. And I do consider myself to be, sort of a social critic, but taking a cue from the Stoics and Buddhists and the like, you would realize that, you can sweat the small stuff and it's not going to be helpful for you mentally. So whereas the world is going to do what the world is going to do, I mean, as we speak, Ukraine is being pummeled by Putin, and it's like, I can't do anything about Ukraine, right? I put a sticker on my car. I gave a little bit of money to a Ukrainian refugee who lives in my community. I curse the television and make Hitler allusions all the time, but there's nothing I can do about Ukraine or Putin being nuclear armed or totalitarianism in the world and so on. So you kind of have to just sort of bring it in and realize that within your own mind and your own heart, within your closest relationships, your home, your community, there's a lot that can be done that sort of circumvents some of those problems that are writ large. And we needn't necessarily be pessimistic and think the world's going to hell in a handbasket and shouldn't be too long until we get destroyed by one of Putin's nuclear weapons. That's not necessarily helpful to anybody. So, in fact, I asked somebody one time, what's the one thing that you could do to help the world? They quoted, the best service that I can be to the world right now is to achieve self-realization. It's kind of a buzzword, so I don't even know if I would endorse that phrase, but you can kind of see what this person was getting at in quoting, I think it's Ramana Maharshi, something like that. She was saying, if I just concentrate on myself and deal with my own life and what I can affect, and work on getting wiser and being kinder and being happier, and being more generous and enlightened and so on, that's going to go a long way to changing the world. There's another quote, maybe Gandhi says something like, for he who has a pair of shoes is not the entire world, overlaid with leather, something like that. Meaning, if you're wearing a good pair of shoes, wherever you step, you're stepping on leather. And that's kind of the basis, the beginning of a positive view of the world, is
Yeah, I think as we come to the close on it and go off to find a philosophical pair of shoes that we can comfortably walk around in,
Yeah.
what was it like writing? What was it like writing a book? What was the difficult times like in it? It must be challenging to stay on course.
There's nothing particularly rewarding about writing a book or promoting it. It's just hard, hard, hard all the way around. And I'm not even a fiction writer. So yeah, I don't even know if I would, I don't think I should probably try my hand at fiction writing. I guess if somebody has a writer, instinct, if it's in their heart, then they should follow that. But I'd say if you can do something else with your time, with yourself, with your journey, is probably better. Now's a tough time to publish a book. I published my first book in 2005, and then I was told that there are a million books published every year. So that's a lot of competition for eyeballs. Now people are even less interested in reading, especially nonfiction, than they were then because of screen time and iPads and internet and phones and all this stuff. And further, the pandemic caused a lot of people to spend time at home and think, you know what I should do? I should write a book. So it's hard to get traction on Amazon. I would certainly say to your listeners, if you ever do read the book and you like it, please, please, please leave me a honest review. Hopefully it will be positive, but an honest review is better than no review, because it's hard to get attention on Amazon.com. And that's the 800-pound gorilla, man.
And maybe to take down that 800-pound gorilla, or at least appease it. But you've generously given us 3 copies of the book as a little competition giveaway. So I think we'll still figure out the logistics of this with show notes and whatnot. But anyone that's listened to even a fraction of our conversation here realizes that Jason, you're clearly a big fan of quotations, and I think it would be interesting to ask as a competition question, listeners to send us in what their favorite quotation is. Can be anything, and why. So if you want to send us in your answer to show@thephilosophist.com, or tweet your answer mentioning @philosophistpod, and you will then be in the running for one of 3 copies of Jason's book, Wisdom, a Very Valuable Virtue That Cannot Be Bought.
Yeah, I look forward to seeing what folks have to say. I will say I'll give a bonus point if you can find what I consider to be a good quote that I do not currently have in my database, which happens to me quite frequently. And it's always kind of humbling. It's like I have 36,000 quotes in that database. And if a new one pops through, it's like, hallelujah. I didn't even realize this was out there. And it creates a little bit of a sense of hope. Like, people looking for a reason to go on. One reason to go on is that there's always a new bit of wisdom out there in the world that you've not yet discovered, and it's just waiting for you.
Yeah, I was trying to think as we were talking what my own take on wisdom is most succinctly. I think it's one of those things. It's one of the first things that you hear, when you're growing up. The first thing that sticks in your head on a particular topic. And I think my one of wisdom was, wisdom's what remains when all the facts are forgotten. I'm not sure how many facts you've brought to the table today. There's certainly been many, and I'd certainly forget some of them. I can't claim to to be able to memorize them all, and so I'm sure will some of the listeners. But I think there will be a bit of wisdom coming out of this on the other side, certainly. So thanks very much, Jason, for your time, and for all it's been great just actually chatting with you. Just in the course of the last month, and I think it's your book is excellent, and I think people really enjoy reading it. So I definitely think people should give it a try, and if people get on that competition, maybe they can book a full copy with a quote as payment. So thanks very much, Jason. It's been a pleasure.
You're welcome. It's been my pleasure too, and I'm happy to give away copies of the book. Obviously one of the things that I am driven by is taming this Amazon beast, but in a more fundamental sense. To give a book to somebody is an absolute type of success, because maybe they will read it and maybe there will be something in there that they appreciate, my words or somebody else's. And that's kind of the best that I can hope for. I really did want to share myself and my view of things in the world, especially the world of philosophy and psychology, but I also wanted to impact a reader and say, hey, this is not rocket science. Wisdom is extremely powerful. It's so interesting. It's very valuable, even though it can't be bought for money. So, dig in and just have fun with it. It's almost like a kaleidoscope of wonder, I think, to delve into the idea of wisdom.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, thanks very much, Jason.
You're welcome.
Can't agree more. And I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
Absolutely.